Obamacare. Ain't nobody got time for that.
Stupid people are ruining America.
The president just wants to take care of you. He just doesn't think you're able to do it for yourself.
There's a very thin line between communism, progressivism, Marxism, socialism.
The empire will strike back.
You still don't know that this was political.
All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of America Our Way. I am your host, Dustin Hoyt. I hope you have all been enjoying the new year. I know I certainly have. I started mine off with a little vacation, much needed, but I'm back. I'm recharged. I'm sitting here at the VLR headquarters, aka wherever I can manage to get a microphone plugged into the internet. It's good to be back on the airwaves. I hope y'all are ready for a show. We've got lots of stuff we want to talk about, and by lots of stuff, I mean different opinions on stuff you may have heard about earlier this week. But that's okay, because as you know, you regular listeners, I tend to disagree with everything everybody's saying. Namely, there seems to be lots and lots of arguments about voting against John Boehner and whether or not it was stupid. Now, I know a lot of you hardcore conservatives that listen to the show, many of you, you agree voting against Boehner is a great idea. And I don't disagree. And a lot of people are taking issue with that statement. Many people who fancy themselves well-versed in politics believe that voting against Boehner was a stick in the mud. It was a stupid idea. It hurt them. It hurt their districts, and it hurt their ability to govern. Now, it's not that it diminished the power of their vote in Congress per se, but people are losing their appointments to certain committees in Congress, and that loses district power. They're not able to look out for their constituents' best interests. So it's not an invalid argument. If the chief power that you count on your representatives for is ramming through more legislation or stalling legislation that are among those the speaker wants to get through, there are many arguments, and these are just a few of them I'm going through here. The idea being that somebody on a committee has a better chance of passing or stopping legislation by killing it in committee or loading it up with poison pill legislation, etc. infinitum. And while that is a valid point, anybody that pays attention to politics, and many of you fall under that category, and many of the people I've seen arguing about this fall under that category, they know good and well that if Speaker Boehner wants something to pass, it's going to pass. If Speaker Boehner, in his very strong Republican majority Congress, wants legislation to get through, it will get through. He's not going to break it apart. He's not going to let people stop it. And if you do try to stop it, you'll lose your committee position anyway. And we've seen that with people who are principled in the past, most notably and most recently, Justin Amash, who I reference frequently here on this show. I think it's important to point out that this has been an issue, and it will continue to be an issue in terms of opposing the speaker. And one thing that I'd kind of like to look at here, I'm trying to find a little more information before I bring it up later in the show. The arguments being made are not wrong. If you crossed the speaker, the Boehner, if you decided to vote against Boehner then you were putting yourself out there. You were hurting your positions on committees. You were actively decreasing your own power. Nobody is contesting that point. How much power, however, is completely up for debate. How much you actually hurt yourself in terms of what you were able to actually accomplish is very much up for debate. Now, you could argue that you might have a harder time introducing legislation because you couldn't get the Speaker to back you. You could argue introducing amendments would become harder without the Speaker there to back you, etc. However, when you look at some of the stuff that gets pushed through by conservatives and Democrats, and you know that some of the more powerful, more potent legislation that gets pushed through, when you know it's going to pass no matter what, when you know that no matter what committee you sit on, no matter what your personal position is, that you're expected to vote as you're told, you are not, quote, released to vote your conscience, you're going to do what you're told to do by the leadership. That's how the power structure works in Congress. People in Congress don't deal in the same currencies as you and I. A lot of people talk about lobbyists and being bought dinners and donations and that kind of stuff. But the real currency in Congress is influence and control. That is how people get elected Speaker. That is how people get elected Majority Leader, Whip, Speaker. That's it. It's all about influence. It's all about what kind of power you can wield. Lyndon B. Johnson being the most notable example of that. Lyndon B. Johnson was infamous for how he manipulated Congress with his power. He was absolutely one of the most powerful and influential people in Washington for many years. And he did it by licking boots on the way up and got enough dirt and influence on everyone where he could intimidate them into doing as he saw fit. Whether or not you think that makes for a good congressman is entirely up to you. I'm sure that if Lyndon B. Johnson held all of the same political views as you and was cramming all of the legislation through that you agreed with 100%, he'd be your guy. Seeing as we are talking about John Boehner, I cannot help but feel he's not my guy. And if you're listening to my show, he's probably not your guy either. Now, many people are disgruntled and they call the fight pointless and say that it's a waste of time, it's showboating, and it hurts you unnecessarily because you gain nothing. The sport of politicking, if you will, involves the cloak and dagger portion and the principled portion. People with principles tend to, on the whole, not have very much power. People who are good at the cloak and dagger tend to have no principles, for the most part, and more power. And that's simply the way the cookie crumbles in D.C. And I'm not oblivious to that, and many people who have made the argument are not oblivious to that. What I do take issue with, and what I do think is important to note, is that voting against Speaker Boehner does not inherently make you stupid even if he's going to win. Voting against Speaker Boehner is not a bad idea because he was going to win anyway. In fact, had they gotten just a couple more votes, he would have been forced to a second ballot. And that's a little embarrassing in terms of the speakership. It would not have ever been close enough for Pelosi to win. And had Pelosi won, I would argue that's not such a bad thing. Bear with me. I know a lot of people just sucked in a lot of air real fast. Calm down. I'll explain it. It's not as bad as it sounds. Bear with me. A vote against Boehner may hurt you on some of your committee appointments. It very well may, and it probably will. However, when your hands are tied behind your back in terms of what you can actually accomplish, and what you're doing is simply mitigating the disaster as best you can, simply throwing up the smallest roadblocks you can get, the largest you can get away with, which inevitably will be small because otherwise you wouldn't get away with them, you run into problems in terms of your principles. While some people might say, you're throwing beans in front of the steamroller, but a hill of beans can eventually become a mountain, or something. I don't know. I'm making this up as I go. That whole argument, a million grains of sand makes a dune, a million pebbles makes a mountain, whatever. There's a million of idioms you can come up with. But when you look at it in terms of historical context, when you look at how Washington has operated since the beginning of Washington, since Philadelphia even, you don't see good politicking stopping the growth of government. You don't see good politicking tearing the nose off of the beast, pulling its teeth and declawing it, debarking it, and chaining it to the woodshed and shooting it for being the rabid monster that it is. You never see that happen. And you never see anyone who goes in moderating themselves have any success. Who is the most successful libertarian? Who is the most successful liberty-minded person to have been in D.C. in years? If you said Reagan, you're wrong. It's Ron Paul. Ron Paul has garnered so much support from so many people that it kind of blew people away. It blew everyone away. And sure, you've got a lot of mocking that goes on in terms of Ron Paul, but you can't disagree with his numbers and the money he was able to generate for himself. You can't. I mean, you can argue that some of his views are kooky, and we can have that argument, but in terms of how successful he was and staying principled, not ever voting against his conscience, or at least not notably, it shows that you can succeed while not selling your soul for your bean in the hill of beans. Now, many people in Congress disagree with me, and that's fine. And many people that fancy themselves politically savvy disagree with me, and that's fine. But if more people were brave enough to vote against Boehner, there would be no more Boehner. If enough people were brave enough to just say, no, you suck, there would be less suck. For those of you who, like me, are tired of the Boehners and the McConnells, you just want them gone. You want them removed. When Eric Cantor lost, and everybody was like, I can't believe that happened, and da-da-da-da-da, and the leadership in the House had to recover, and Scalise stepped up into the whip position, and Coburn stepped up, blah, 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 blah. They didn't say too much about it, because they were hit pretty hard. When the number 2 gets smacked like that, there's an issue. And that issue is brought to a head with this argument. That issue is brought to a head by these votes. Whether or not we decide that we want people in Congress who are okay with standing up and saying, no, this guy is going to bail on us, this guy is going to push bad strategy, this guy is going to cause us more problems than he's worth, then it ought to be very, very simple which way you want people to vote. Now, a lot of people go, oh, it's not as nuanced as that. It's you got to have somebody valid running against them, blah, blah, blah. Look, what is the best thing for the American economy? Is it a functioning government that's able to pass lots of bills? Hell no. And anybody who says that's the case is a moron, and you should immediately not listen to them.